Today, South Korea is a dynamic and influential nation renowned for its technological innovation, vibrant culture, and economic prowess. Home to global tech giants like Samsung and LG, the country is a leader in cutting-edge technology, and its capital, Seoul, is a bustling metropolis that is considered one of the wealthiest cities in Asia. However, in the 1990s, South Korea was still a work in progress, and during this period, the country experienced a rapid economic boom. Skyscrapers quickly rose, construction was everywhere, and new developments appeared almost daily. This was a period of intense growth that helped establish South Korea as a major powerhouse in Asia. However, this rapid advancement was not always smooth sailing. In the 1990s, South Korea experienced a significant surge in the construction of retail spaces and shopping malls, particularly in Seoul. With rising incomes, developers recognized that people had more disposable income and were eager to spend on shopping and leisure activities. This led to a boom in commercial development, transforming the urban landscape and catering to the growing consumer demand. One of these malls was named the Sampoong department store. With construction beginning in 1987 and completion in 1990, the mall was destined to be a premier shopping destination in Seoul. However, in 1995, just a few years after its grand opening, the Sampoong department store became the site of the largest peacetime disaster in South Korean history. On the morning of June 29, 1995, the Sampoong department store in Seoul was teeming with life. Shoppers went about their day, unaware that behind the scenes, the building's management was in full panic mode. Large cracks had appeared on the ceiling and walls of the top floor, prompting management to conduct an emergency meeting and close the affected area to the public. Inside the conference room, civil engineers and building experts were hurriedly summoned to the scene to make a quick assessment of the mall's structure. However, after a few moments, the building manager burst into the meeting room, wide-eyed and breathless. He had just come from the 5th floor, where he heard the ominous rumbling of concrete. The result of the inspection was brief and grim. The building was on the brink of collapse. During the meeting, the tension among Sampoong's top managers was palpable. Some directors urgently pleaded for an immediate evacuation, but the building's owner, Lee Jun, refused. He couldn't bear the thought of closing the mall for a day, as it would only result in major financial losses. Little did he know, this decision would cost not only money, but also countless human lives. At 5:52 p.m., shoppers and workers in Sampoong department store were startled by a loud crack that echoed through the mall. The roof had collapsed, sending the building's heavy air conditioning units crashing through the already overloaded 5th floor. Alarms blared, and workers frantically tried to evacuate the building. But by this time, it was too late. One by one, the floors of the Sampoong department store collapsed, ultimately crashing down into the basement. In just 20 seconds, the entire structure had crumbled, and now, over 1,500 people were buried alive. From One Up Media, this is Mass Murders. In the 1980s, South Korea shifted from an agrarian economy to a highly industrialized one, witnessing substantial growth in major industries such as electronics, automobiles, and shipbuilding. This era also saw a massive construction boom, with new skyscrapers, highways, and infrastructure projects reshaping South Korea into a modern, urban landscape. At that time, There was also a significant hiring wave for property developers, architects, and engineers. And among those who joined the building frenzy was a man named Lee Jun. Lee Jun was a former military officer who had established a construction company named the Donggyong Industry. While he was initially focused on projects for the US military and public infrastructure, he was noted to be an ambitious leader who strived for the rapid economic growth and urbanization of South Korea. Hence, several years after founding the company, he renamed it to Sampoong Construction and leveraged his connections to secure larger-scale projects. One of his major projects involved constructing a residential building with 4 underground floors in the Gangnam district, a neighborhood renowned for its luxury properties and home to some of the wealthiest people in South Korea. Although Lee Jun obtained the permit to build his structure, he felt that this achievement did not fully satisfy his ambition. He yearned to accomplish something even grander. In addition to the boom in infrastructure and construction, South Korea's retail industry experienced significant growth in the late 1980s. Seeking to capitalize on the thriving retail market, Lee Jun abandoned his residential property plans and set his sights on constructing a department store. However, he was well aware of the numerous obstacles that stood in the way of his new project. And like many ambitious risk-takers, he looked for shortcuts, a decision that would prove deadly. In the lead-up to the 1988 Summer Olympics, the Seoul capital area experienced a significant development boom. Due to bans on international construction contractors signing contracts for projects in Seoul at the time, nearly all buildings had to be erected by South Korean companies. These companies were known to build their structures with intense speed, given the large number of projects assigned to them. The Sampoong Group began construction of the Sampoong department store in 1987 on a tract of land in the Socho district that had previously been used as a landfill. When Jun decided to build the department store, he had to make significant changes, including removing several parts to accommodate typical mall facilities like escalators. However, in order to do that, he needed to replace several critical support columns, a decision that was heavily opposed by the contractor, Woosung Construction. These concrete columns were crucial. They bore and distributed the weight of the entire building. Additionally, they provided lateral support to withstand forces such as strong winds and earthquakes. Concerned about the potential risks, Woosung's engineers warned Lee Jun that removing these support columns would render the entire department store unsafe and prone to collapse. The changes proposed by Lee Jun were deemed too dangerous, and as they were unwilling to compromise on safety, the engineers refused to proceed with his plans. Frustrated, Lee Jun fired the contractor and ordered his own workers to continue building his dream department store. For the next few years, construction went according to Lee Jun's plans, and in 1989, the department store was open to the public. The bright pink building stood out in Gangnam district, and Lee Jun was likely immensely proud of his achievement. Riding high on the construction and retail boom in South Korea, Lee Jun might have even thought his contractors were wrong about the dangers. The removal of the pillars had seemingly no adverse effect. The building stood strong and steady. Additionally, the department store began drawing in an average of over 4,000 visitors each day, a significant number at the time. But for Lee Jun, this success was not enough. He envisioned attracting even more customers and boosting profits further. To achieve this, he planned to open a 5th floor, complete with restaurants, shops, and even a skating rink. This ambitious expansion was aimed at transforming the department store into a premier shopping and entertainment destination, cementing its status as a cornerstone of Gangnam's bustling commercial scene. However, Lee Jun's greed and negligence would soon result in a painful lesson. Despite initial success, there were murmurs of structural weaknesses in the department store. And Lee Jun's plans to add another floor only increased concerns among building engineers, inspectors, and managers. When Lee Jun proposed transforming the rooftop into a food court, contractors immediately raised red flags. They warned that the additional weight from concrete and air conditioning units would overload the building structure, potentially leading to a collapse. Despite their urgent concerns, Lee Jun dismissed their warnings, prioritizing expansion over safety. And when the contractors refused to proceed, he fired them. To make matters worse, during the construction of the 5th floor, Lee Jun made a critical error. Engineers had advised using helicopters or cranes to airlift or disassemble the air conditioning units on the rooftop, but he deemed these methods too costly. Instead, he instructed his workers to drag the units across the rooftop, all 16 tons of air conditioning equipment. All this dragging had caused significant structural damage to the rooftop. But whether Lee Jun was unaware of this damage or chose to ignore it remains uncertain. Nevertheless, his decision set the stage for a catastrophic failure. It was sometime in April 1995, 6 years since the Sampoong department store had opened its doors to the public. On this particular day, a building inspector climbed to the 5th floor for his routine checks. However, upon reaching the floor, his eyes were immediately drawn to significant cracks spreading across the ceiling. As he looked around, he noticed these cracks were everywhere, forming an alarming spider web-like pattern. Immediately, he alerted the management and relayed his findings. In response, the building engineers swiftly recommended a structural assessment and urged that repair work be scheduled as soon as possible. However, Lee Jun and the executives dismissed these recommendations. For Lee Jun, who did not have an engineering background, the cracks seemed like natural occurrences and posed no cause for alarm. Additionally, getting contractors to carry out maintenance work only meant additional expenses, which was the very thing he wanted to avoid. Rather than addressing the root of the problem, the building's management instructed workers to move their merchandise and stores from the top floor to the basement, believing that this would relieve the stress on the top floor and would mitigate any immediate danger. However, the building's integrity continued to deteriorate and more cracks had begun to appear on the 5th floor. On the morning of June 29, 1995, the Sampoong department store buzzed with its usual activity. Shoppers browsed the aisles, and workers moved about, assisting customers and restocking shelves. But high above everyone, on the 5th floor, large ominous cracks snaked across the ceiling, which were growing at an alarming rate. What started as thin fissures now spread and deepened with each passing hour. The management of the department store took notice of this and were now faced with a tough decision. Several concerned staff members urgently recommended an immediate evacuation of all staff and shoppers, but the executives, particularly Lee Jun, hesitated. In his mind, evacuating the thousands of shoppers in the building would result in a significant loss of revenue, a risk he was unwilling to take. Instead of sounding the alarm, they opted to cordon off the 5th floor, relocating all merchandise and stores to the lower levels. While this was going on, the public remained unaware of the growing danger above them, as the management had decided to keep it under wraps. By lunchtime, the situation had worsened significantly. The cracks on the top floor had widened considerably, even causing the ceiling of the 4th floor to sag under the strain. As the fissures grew larger, several shoppers and anxious staff glanced upward along the corridors with increasing unease. Some shoppers sensed something off, a palpable tension in the air, yet the majority remained oblivious to the growing danger around them. Despite the alarming signs, the building's management refused to issue any evacuation orders. Instead, they held on to the hope that the building would be sturdy enough. Meanwhile, the cracks continued to spread, silently and ominously. At this moment, the Sampoong department store was a ticking time bomb, and the countdown had begun. The upper floors had already been closed to the customers, but the ground floor and basement was still packed with hundreds of unsuspecting shoppers. Then at precisely 5:50 p.m., the inevitable struck. The building began to emit a series of loud, ominous cracks. And the staff, realizing the gravity of the situation, finally sounded the alarm to evacuate. Many shoppers were confused, with some even suspecting a false alarm, but the reality of the situation became all too clear as people began moving towards the exits. Moments later, with a deafening roar, the roof of the department store collapsed, and all 16 tons of air conditioning units crashed through the 5th floor, triggering a catastrophic domino effect. The support columns had completely given way, causing the entire building to pancake, floor by floor, into the basement. It took less than 20 seconds for the department store to collapse into a pile of rubble. However, for those trapped inside, those 20 seconds felt like an eternity. Within the collapse zone, dust and debris filled the air, mingling with the cries of the innocent shoppers and frantic calls for help. As the dust began to settle, it was evident that the once vibrant department store had been reduced to a heap of twisted metal, shattered glass, and broken concrete. Amid the rubble, hundreds of shoppers and staff lay trapped, their desperate cries for help muffled by the debris surrounding them. Some were buried up to their necks in concrete, while others were wedged between fallen beams and collapsed walls. Within minutes of the collapse, the first rescue teams arrived on the scene. And soon, entire squads of firefighters, police, and military personnel had gathered at the ruins. To each rescue worker, the scale of the disaster was immediately apparent, but there was no time to dwell on the magnitude of the task ahead. If they wanted any chance to save lives, every second counted. At this point, the estimated death toll was staggering. It was believed that at least 1,500 people were trapped in the rubble, with at least a third expected to be found dead. The immediate aftermath after the collapse was chaotic and desperate. Twisted metal, slabs of concrete, and shattered glass filled the area, and this scene was broadcasted live across the nation. Across South Korea, millions watched as rescue personnel worked tirelessly to pull people from the rubble. Each time someone was brought out, onlookers could only pray for signs of life. But when they saw the white sheet covering the body, they knew the worst had happened. One of those watching the news was a young woman named So Hae-jin. It was late in the evening on June 29th, 1995, but that didn't stop her from leaving her house to search for her childhood best friend, Park Sung-hyun. Her worst fears had come true. She knew her friend was in the mall at the time of the collapse. Park was a clerk in the mall, and Hae-jin feared that her closest friend, whom she considered a sister, might be trapped or worse, dead. As she raced to the site where the department store once stood, Hae-jin clung to a fragile hope, praying fervently for her friend's safety. Upon arrival, she was met with a scene of utter chaos, rescue personnel, distraught families, and the relentless noise of machinery. Deep down, she knew that only a miracle would bring her friend back to her. Unbeknownst to Hae-jin, Park was trapped about 12 feet beneath the debris that entombed the basement of the shopping mall. But it would take rescuers over 2 excruciating weeks to reach her and pull her from the wreckage. The day after the incident, batches of heavy cranes and machinery was summoned at the site to assist in the rescue efforts. While the rescue teams responded swiftly, they soon realized that the operation was far more challenging than initially anticipated. They had to navigate not only the treacherous debris, but also the growing, restless crowd outside. By nightfall, the number of missing persons reports had already surpassed 900, and more concerned family members and friends started to surround the scene. At this time, rescuers had already pulled out dozens of survivors, which sparked moments of hope for the onlookers. But the grim discovery of several dead bodies, some which were dismembered, continued to mount. Suddenly, among the anxious crowd of people who had gathered, a commotion broke out. The chief supervisor of the search and rescue operations announced through a megaphone that the mayor of Seoul has given orders to halt the rescue efforts due to safety concerns. Immediately, the crowd erupted in disbelief and anger, as their only hope of finding their loved ones alive was now hanging by a thread. Images from the initial moments after the disaster clearly showed that while the facade of the building was still standing, it was dangerously unstable and posed a serious threat to both rescuers and those still trapped inside. The chief supervisor of the rescue efforts explained to the crowd that the rescue operations had to be paused to prevent further collapse. But despite this, the desperate and anxious crowd demanded to be allowed inside to help save their loved ones, willing to face the danger themselves. This reaction is entirely understandable. Imagine being a family member or relative of someone trapped inside the building. In that moment, you would be driven to do everything possible to save them. The uncertainty of whether your loved ones were dead or alive would be unbearable, and you would know that the longer they remain trapped under the rubble, the greater the risk of them not surviving. The desperation to act, to do something, anything to help, would be overwhelming, pushing you to face any danger for the chance to save those you care about. Despite the government dispatching military and police officers to control the mob, news about stopping the rescue operations sparked nationwide protests. From every corner of South Korea, relatives and friends demanded the authorities to continue searching for survivors and bodies. Under mounting public pressure, the mayor of Seoul quickly reversed the decision, and the rescue mission resumed. In response, guy cables were used to stabilize the building's skeletal remains, providing a fragile lifeline for those trapped below. As more bodies were discovered, families fervently sought justice for their loved ones' untimely deaths. They demanded immediate answers. Where are their loved ones? What happened to them? And most importantly, who was behind this? Amid the chaos and ongoing rescue efforts, an investigation was launched to uncover the reasons behind the collapse. At this time, various theories began to surface. Some plausible, others more outrageous. Some speculated it was a terrorist attack by North Korea, while others suspected that it was a gas explosion. However, Professor Chung Lan of Dankook University's Engineering School was among the many experts who dismissed these possibilities. As part of the investigative team, Chung was in fact one of the many who initially considered terrorism and gas explosions as likely causes. But during his first visit to the incident site, his perspective was altered. The destruction was unlike anything he had ever seen, leading him to suspect something more sinister. As he walked around the site, his attention was caught by the burnt cars and scorch marks around the area. To him, it suggested that the fire had started from gasoline, leaking out of cars that had been crushed in the underground garage. This was evidence that pointed to the origin of the fire being the damaged vehicles rather than a gas explosion. If it had been a gas explosion, the burn marks and the charred areas would have been much more severe. Later, investigators also consulted bomb experts in the US, who likewise ruled out any possibility of this incident being the act of a terrorist attack. They noted that the position of the concrete slabs and debris pointed to the collapse happening downward, not outward, which essentially means that the building structure had fallen in on itself. If it had been an explosion, the force would have flung parts of the building outward, but this was not the case. Instead, the remnants indicated a downward collapse. These findings reinforced Professor Chung's suspicions that the structure of the department store was flawed from the start. Driven by this realization, he knew he had to gather all the blueprints, documents, and records related to the ill-fated mall in order to get to the truth. And that's exactly what he did. Back at the site, it had already been weeks since the collapse, but rescuers continued to work tirelessly, risking their lives to pull both the survivors and the dead bodies from the wreckage. Many of those rescued from the rubble were suffering from dehydration and serious injuries, prompting medical personnel to treat them in makeshift triage centers set up around the area. Due to the scale of the disaster and the number of people affected, nearby hospitals were overwhelmed. However, this did not hinder the rescue efforts. The coordination between rescue workers and medical teams ensured that every life saved received immediate care. Meanwhile, So Hae-jin's anxiety remained high. Up to this point, she had received no news about her best friend, Park Sung-hyun, and the agony of waiting was overwhelming. One day, the stress of waiting got to her, and she rushed down to the site in hope that she would return with her friend Park. In a moment of sheer determination, she dashed towards the wreckage, leaping over the cordon lines as rescuers yelled and chased after her from behind. With her heart pounding out of her chest, she grabbed a large block of cement and moved it with all her might. Eventually, the block shifted, and underneath it, she saw a pale patch that resembled human skin. Hoping that it was her friend Park, she summoned the strength to push the block of cement away, but found the body of a 35-year-old woman instead. The authorities who caught up with her immediately signaled the rescue team to bring a stretcher. In her words, So Hae-jin says, "I am shocked. So many injured and bleeding, the dead being carried away. I start scrambling at the rubble with my hands. I keep digging. I don't know why I'm doing it. I just need to do something." Defeated and exhausted, Hae-jin let the officers lead her away, her head hanging down. She still couldn't accept the possibility that Park might be dead. But on the 17th day, a miracle happened. As authorities shifted their focus from rescue to debris removal, a drill technician broke away a piece of concrete, revealing a small air pocket. Inside, a foot appeared, and medics quickly pulled out a young woman. She was alive. This woman was Park Sung-hyun, and she had survived inside the rubble for more than 2 weeks by drinking rainwater from a tiny crack in the concrete pile that was above her. When So Hae-jin heard the news, she screamed in shock and rushed to the hospital, her body lightly trembling with a mix of fear and relief. Her prayers to see her friend alive had finally been answered. Park Sung-hyun was the last survivor freed from the wreckage of the collapsed mall. By this time, the death toll had reached 502, with over 30 people still missing and nearly 1,000 injured. As South Korea grieved for the victims, Professor Chung was diligently working, poring over the numerous documents and records related to the department store. Soon, he would uncover a pattern of negligence and widespread corruption that would ultimately reshape South Korea's building code. Professor Chung's investigation revealed that the construction of the Sampoong department store was flawed from the very beginning. He found multiple errors and violations during the construction phase, and even after the mall was opened to the public in 1989. These red flags included poorly laid foundations and substandard concrete used for the ceilings and walls. According to him, the building had used a construction method where the floors were supported directly by columns, but the columns that had been built to support the department store were too thin. They should have been at least 80 centimeters wide, but they were only 60. Also, There were only 8 steel reinforcement bars embedded in the columns instead of the required 16, and they were placed incorrectly, making the structure even weaker. To make things worse, he found that a 5th floor was added to the building, equipped with restaurants and heavy equipment. But the trouble only got worse 2 years before the collapse, when workers were moving the large air conditioning units that were on the roof. Dragging these heavy units around had caused cracks in the support columns, and each time the air conditioners were turned on, the vibrations only deepened the cracks. While these findings were shocking and disturbing, one question remained unanswered in Professor Chung's investigation. How did the government allow a shopping mall full of engineering mistakes and violations to operate for 6 years? During the investigation, more witnesses, including the building's owners led by Lee Jun, were brought in, and they soon uncovered the terrible consequences of South Korea's rapid construction boom. Building infrastructure, whether commercial or residential, requires significant time and money. For businessmen like Lee Jun, time equaled money, and delays meant higher costs. To speed up construction, they needed funds, which they secured for the Sampoong department store. During the investigation, prosecutors discovered through financial records that the mall owners had received illegal payments and suspicious transactions. Additionally, interviews with construction workers, officials, and several whistleblowers provided more evidence of bribes paid to expedite construction and overlook safety violations. When questioned about this, Lee Jun was cooperative, and the findings matched his statements. However, what really shocked investigators was that despite the catastrophic loss of life, Lee Jun expressed more concern for his finances rather than his customers. The judges later ruled this as a clear sign of greed and criminal negligence. On December 27, 1995, about 6 months after the disaster, judges in a South Korean court announced their verdict. Lee Jun was found guilty of criminal negligence and was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. Although prosecutors had initially pushed for a 20-year sentence, it was eventually reduced to 7.5 years on appeal. His son, Lee Han-sang, the department store's CEO, received a 7-year sentence for accidental homicide and corruption. Additionally, city official Lee Chung-woo, the chief administrator of the area where the store was located, was sentenced to 3 years in jail for bribery. Hwang Chol-min, a former chief for the area, was also found guilty of accepting a 12 million won bribe from Lee Jun and received a 10-year prison sentence. Other officials and store executives were also jailed, including the top managers of the company that constructed the store. The families of the victims sought compensation, with an average amount of $250,000 each. The city of Seoul, acting on behalf of the store's owner, offered $220,000 per victim, citing financial limitations as the reason for the reduced amount. Despite the city's offer, the pain and loss experienced by the families is something that no amount of money could alleviate. 2 months after the collapse, in a move to make amends, Lee Jun and his son, Lee Han-sang, pledged their entire wealth to compensate the victims' families. This gesture, while significant, could not erase the tragedy that had unfolded. The collapse had left a permanent scar on the community, and the consequences extended beyond financial compensation. In 2003, after completing his prison sentence, Lee Jun passed away due to complications from diabetes, high blood pressure, and kidney disease. From the latest records, his son then left South Korea to become an evangelist in Mongolia. The Sampoong department store disaster remains one of the most tragic events in South Korea's history. The collapse claimed 502 lives, injured 937, and shattered countless families. It also exposed deep-rooted issues of negligence and corruption within the construction industry, leading to significant changes in building regulations and safety standards. In the years following the disaster, The site where the Sampoong department store once stood has been transformed, with new buildings rising in its place. These modern structures are symbols of progress and renewal. However, beneath this surface, memories of the horrific collapse linger. Mass Murders is a one-up media original. A quick word on our reenactments and dramatizations. While we can't know exactly what they say, think or feel at the moment, it is all based on research. Mass Murders is produced by Ethan Sam. Our executive producer is Guang Jin. Story writing and research by M. Audio engineering by Vung An and Ethan Sam. Narrated by Jason. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.